The papal bull provided instructions that Indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because Indigenous people are not human, they don't have sovereignty in government.
I just remember reading it and thinking, like, this can't be real. This isn't something that makes sense. This is something that's like inhumane and just not something that was fair to the people that were the protectors of this land. So.
I remember reading it and thinking, that doesn't make sense. How can you simply take over somebody's territory by saying you no longer exist or you never existed?
It's relevant because not only is it basically the root of the whole structure of property law in Canada and the United States and Australia, for instance, but it is thoroughly enmeshed in the structures of our law so deeply that it's often difficult to even spot it.
This fiction, this hidden foundation still lives with us because we don't assume, by and large, that Indigenous peoples today are primitive or have lower social skills on this kind of hierarchy of civilizations. But nevertheless, the law continues to assume that sovereignty of the crown is paramount, that crown title is underlying all of our land, when in fact that comes from nowhere. It comes from just an assertion.
The underlying question is how, in the Canadian context, for instance, where does the Crown get its right to hold underlying title for all lands, which is the way that our law is structured? Where does the Crown get its jurisdiction over all matters? And there's this sense that this came out of the ether, it was always thus.
It wasn't an empty land, and there were lots of government sort of structures. The Mi'kmaq had different provinces. They used to come together on, regular meetings. The 5 nations and then the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. These were people who were mostly farmers.
In Ontario, it's estimated that there was about 90 to 110,000 people living here when the Europeans came in. When the Jesuits, for instance, came in 1615 along with Samuel de Champlain, encountered the Wendat people, the Huron. There they lived as 40,000 people between what's now Barrie, Orillia, and Collingwood. And they were in villages of 2,000 people, and there were 200 miles of roads that were connecting these villages.
And there were trade routes everywhere. They found parrot feathers in the Arctic. The trade routes were the incredible way of getting around and ensuring that people were able to survive. So if you've got all of this territory in corn from the early Haudenosaunee peoples, and you've got northern hunters with moose meat and deer meat, and there's going to be trade. This area was settled because of the wealth of the waters as well, not just the land.
I think virtually all the social ills in Indigenous communities today are the result of the disorientation that occurred for Indigenous populations because of that residential school era. And it's primarily an emotional and spiritual dislocation. Yes, it was physical and economic and social and other kinds of dynamics like that, but for Indigenous people ourselves, it's that emotional, spiritual disorientation that becomes a major complication in life.
And for me, I've always said it's about the loss of spirituality, the loss of knowing who they are as Indigenous people, Indigenous youth, And that goes, that's one of the legacies of the residential schools. So a lot of our young people don't know who they are.
And a lot of our men don't have, traditional culture. They don't understand where they came from. They don't really speak about it anymore. Yeah, so it's really sad. Like with the residential schools, there's a lot of impacts.
When I think about the Doctrine of Discovery, the image that comes to mind, and it's not an image that I am at all happy about, but here it is: spiritual arrogance of the worst kind.
All Christian churches who relied upon the Doctrine of Discovery principle, I think, have to make it very clear that they're no longer relying upon that, or that they recognize the invalidity of that.
Christianity got entangled with this process of colonization. It was kind of fuel to the fire. And that's a devastating thing to come to grips with.
I think that our churches are one of the biggest institutional racism organizations in Canada. I mean, if you look at the structure, where are the Indigenous people in that structure?
Well, I think if racism is grounded on an understanding that somehow we're going to be saved from ourselves as a people, then I think racism is rife.
I am very proud to be a Catholic Christian and also a Mohawk woman. We as church people need to be strong enough and not to say, oh no, it didn't happen, or, well, I'm sorry. Just listen, and you don't have to say anything.